Good morning. Today we are going to talk about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In this chapter, we are going to connect aggregate demand and aggregate supply with the IS and LM model. First of all, let's start with a review about what are the main causes of demand shocks. There are four main causes. Number one, consumption. Changes in consumer confidence or stock market prices and housing prices can alter or change autonomous consumption. So any factor that affect autonomous consumption will affect the consumption level. Number two, planned investment. Planned investment will be affected by expectations about future profit or optimism of the investors. Number three, changes in money supply. Changes in money supply. Changes in money supply will affect interest rate, which will affect consumption and investment. And finally, exchange rates. As exchange rate will affect the net exports. So this is the aggregate demand function. So factors will affect aggregate demand or cause a shift to aggregate demand are autonomous consumption, which is a component of consumption, which will affect the aggregate demand, planned investment, and money supply will affect interest rates. So interest rate will affect the interest sensitive components of consumption and investment. And finally, exchange rate will affect the net exports part of this equation. So what's aggregate demand? Aggregate demand, or to be more precise, aggregate demand curve shows the different combinations of the price level and real output at which the money and the commodity markets are both at equilibrium. So an increase in C or I or G or net exports will cause an increase in aggregate demand and a rightward shift of aggregate demand curve. So let's drive the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model. So this is real GDP and interest rate, and this will be real GDP and the price level. This is the IS curve, and this is LM curve. LM at specific level of money supply and price level. Now let's assume that prices are going to change while money supply is constant, or to be more precise, while nominal money supply is constant. As a result, real money supply will change and the LM curve will shift. If price increase while money supply is constant, so in this case, the value of real money supply will change, will decrease, and LM curve will shift to the left. So let's assume that prices will increase from B0 to B1. As a result, real money supply will decrease from MS node to MS node, from MS node over B node to MS node over B1, and the LM curve will shift to the left. LM curve will shift to the left from LM node to LM1. So this is the new LM1 at money supply node over B1. This is the old equilibrium point at this level of price at B node. This is Y node. As LM shift to the left, we have a new equilibrium point or new intersection point of IS and LM at Y1 and the higher price level B1, for example. Now let's assume that price decrease instead of increase from B node to B2, while money supply is constant. As a result, LM curve will shift to the right. This is LM2 at MS node and B2. We have a new equilibrium point at Y2 and lower price level, which is B2. Now you can connect the 3 points together. This will be the aggregate supply curve. Aggregate demand curve. This is how to drive the aggregate demand curve from the ISLM model. But now, what is the impact of a change in different factors on the aggregate demand curve? Returning back to The factors affect or that causes shocks to aggregate demand. What is the impact of change in any of the autonomous expenditure or autonomous spending on aggregate demand, or what is the impact of a change in money supply on aggregate demand? In this case, we are going to here is real GDP and interest rate, real GDP and the price level, the initial IS curve and LM curve at MS node and B node. This is Y node and B node. This is the aggregate demand curve. In this case, we are going to assume that money supply will increase while price level is constant. Money supply will increase from MS node to MS1, and the price level is constant at B node. So as a result, real money supply will increase from MS1, MS nodes to MS1, and the LM curve will shift to the right. We would like to keep the price level constant at B node. So in this case, aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So at the same price level, you can buy more goods and services, or you can demand more goods and services. So in this case, as money supply increases while prices are constant, so aggregate demand will shift to the right. What about autonomous expenditure? Let's start with the original situation. This is IS node and LM node, and this is B node and Y node, aggregate demand node. Now let's assume that autonomous expenditure has increased due to shift in consumption, autonomous consumption, or planned investment, any factor that affects autonomous expenditure. If there is an increase in autonomous expenditure, this will cause a shift to IS curve to the right. So we have a new IS curve. So driving While drawing aggregate demand, we are going to assume that the price level is constant in order to know whether there is an increase, whether there is a shift or not in aggregate demand. So in this case, as IS curve increase and there isn't any change in price level, as we said, LM node is going to be constant without any change. So in this case, we are going to keep prices constant. As a result, aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So from this, we can conclude that in order to be able to draw or to drive aggregate demand curve, we have to assume that all other factors are constant except price levels. While in order to identify whether there is a shift to aggregate demand curve to the left or to the right, we have to keep prices constant and change any other factor. This is about aggregate demand. What about aggregate supply? As we said before, that we have to differentiate between short-run aggregate supply curve and long-run aggregate supply curve. Short-run aggregate supply curve shows the amount of output that business firms are willing to produce at different price levels, while holding constant the nominal wage rate. So this means that short-run aggregate supply curve will show the relationship between production and the price level while keeping nominal GDP constant, nominal wage rate constant. It's an upward sloping curve. As an increase in price level will cause an increase in profits, as we assume that wages and other input costs are constant. So in this case, profits are going to increase. And as a result, firms are going to increase their production or produce more. What about the long run aggregate supply curve? In case of long run aggregate supply curve, we assume that the nominal wage rate has fully adjusted to any changes in the price level. So it shows the relationship between firm's output and the price level, while assuming that nominal wage rate has fully adjusted to any change in the price level. So we have three different possible shapes of the aggregate supply curve. Horizontal, vertical, and positively sloped. In this case, we assume that prices are fixed, but this is not realistic. One, It can't explain inflation. Fixed price and not realistic. Or vertical, and in this case, prices are perfectly flexible. And this is a useful tool if you would like to analyze or explain inflation, but can't explain unemployment. Or positively sloped, and this assume that wages are fixed, but it can't be applied for the long run. So it will be helpful if you would like to explain fluctuations in the short run. So this is fluctuations in the short run. Now we would like to drive the short-run aggregate supply curve. Actually, the long-run aggregate supply curve is a situation of achieving full employment in the economy or achieving the highest possible production level. So it's gonna be somehow a constant, constant amount based on the amount of resources available in this economy. So we are not going to be concerned with long-run aggregate supply curve anymore, but now we would like to drive short-run aggregate supply curve. Assume that wages are fixed in the short run and prices are sticky. So if prices rise, firms benefit because the real wage rate is going to decrease. Okay, and in this case, firms can increase output if the price level rises because their profits are going to increase. So mainly, short-run aggregate supply curve is related to the labor market or the labor demand curve. So if this is the employment level at a real wage rate W node over B node, so this is B node, and firms are going to produce, or this is the amount of output produced at this level. Now let's assume that there is an increase in the price level. Prices are going to increase while nominal wage rate is constant. In this case, as prices increase while nominal wage rate is constant, so the real wage rate is going to decrease, and firms can employ more workers and produce more. So this is the new real wage rate. In this case, we are going to employ more workers and produce more goods. What about a decrease in the price level? If there is a decrease in the price level instead of an increase in the price level, so nominal wage rate is going to increase. Sorry, real wage rate is going to increase, and firms are going to employ less workers and produce less. So now we can connect the 3 points together. This will be the short-run aggregate supply curve at wage node, as the nominal wage rate, there isn't any change in the nominal wage rate, and different employment levels. What about shifts in aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply curve? If you are going to assume instead of a changing price level, you would like to keep the price level constant while change the wage rate, this will cause a shift in the aggregate supply curve. Okay, let's start with the initial situation. This is the short-run aggregate supply curve at a wage rate W node and the price level B node. Now let's assume that there is an increase in the nominal wage rate. An increase in nominal wage rate will cause a shift to aggregate supply curve. An increase in nominal wage rate will cause a shift to aggregate supply curve to the left. So now we would like to determine the equilibrium real wage rate. Equilibrium real wage rate will be determined based on demand and supply in the labor force. So now what is the effect of an increase in planned autonomous spending on the general price level. This is the aggregate demand curve, and here we have long run aggregate supply curve and short run aggregate supply curve. So this point is the point of equilibrium in this economy, equilibrium in the short run and in the long run. Now let's assume that aggregate planned expenditure there is an increase in aggregate planned expenditure, say consumption, investment, or any factor. As we said, aggregate planned expenditure will affect the aggregate demand curve, and the aggregate demand curve in this case will shift to the right. So we have a new equilibrium point in the short run, and in this case, equilibrium in the short run will differ from equilibrium in the long run. And the price level is going to increase in the short run and will be more and more in the long run. Actually, say this is A, B, and C. Point C is not a sustainable position. Sorry, not points. Because in this case, prices are going to increase and real wage rate will decrease till we reach a new equilibrium point. So this is just an equilibrium in the short run. It's a temporary situation. It will adjust based on the fall or the degree of responsiveness of the wage rate in the economy. Okay, actually, point B is point of equilibrium in the long run. So point C is just a temporary situation and equilibrium in the short run, but at the long run we are going to achieve the point B, which is at a higher price level. This figure can help in order to explain business cycle fluctuations, as equilibrium in the short run is a temporary one due to an increase in price level or a decrease in price level. There is a change in this equilibrium position, which will affect or cause fluctuations in the business cycle, or an increase in output and a fall or a decrease in output later on. Okay, this is the end of our lecture today. Thank you and see you next week.